All right, good morning once again. It is time. We're ready to kick off our next speaker. So if there's people that have joined us since the first start, a couple quick housekeeping notes. Emergency exit right there. If for some reason that's obstructed, just outside the entry doors to the left through the office, there's another exit. Washrooms, women's washroom straight across. There's a pair of unisex washrooms in the far corner, or the men's washrooms are upstairs. We ask if you have food or drink, limit them to in this room. They should not be going out into the museum proper. So we have two audiences in the room here, and then our online audience. Appreciate everyone joining us. So at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Graham. Graham Broad is a member of the Department of History at King's College at the University of Western Ontario since 2009. He's a scholar in the field of war and society studies, studying culture in times of conflict. He's the author of A Small Price to Pay, Consumer Culture on the Canadian Homefront, 1839 to 1945, shortlisted for the CP Stacey Award, 1 in 1,000, The Life and Death of Captain Eddie McKay, Royal Flying Corps, who we're going to hear much more about today, and Part of Life Itself, The War Diary of Leslie H. Miller. A recipient of the King's Award for Excellence in Teaching 2020, Professor Broad teaches war and society studies, historical theory, and methods in the Foundations program at King's. He's also a guide with the Canadian Battlefields Foundation. With Jonathan Vance, he's the co-director of the SHRC-funded website Wartime Canada, a digital archive of Canadian wartime
ephemera.
Thank you. Ephemera. Should practice my pronunciation beforehand. And then more importantly, Graham has been an outstanding supporter of what we try to do with the History Symposium. He was one of the academic panel or judges for our very first 3-minute thesis competition. So please join me in welcoming Graham.
Thank you very much. This is going to be hard for me because when I'm teaching in the classroom, I walk around, and here I'm going to be challenged to stand still in front of the microphones, especially since I'm trying to get my steps in. So I might do this while I'm talking. I am going to set a timer though. I was thinking about what Leroy was saying, and I'm increasingly convicted that when we teach the world wars, we have to start to get beyond a triumphalist, nationalistic narrative. We can show gratitude for those who fought and died for our polity. We can be grateful that we won the world wars, which particularly in the case of the second, we have to be. But I think we also need to look squarely at what happened in the world wars, and particularly about the nature of the British Empire, which was it was a racist institution. And we need to bear that in mind. We need to be able to look squarely at what happened in the past if we're to serve the memory of those who lived in the past properly. I want to talk today about a guy who I think not a lot of Londoners know about, who's rather an interesting guy, Eddie McKay, and about whom I wrote a book in 2017. That book is both a biography and also a discourse on historical method for the benefit of students. It was really my challenge writing this book to ask the question, could I write a biography of a guy who wasn't famous, of a guy who didn't anticipate the needs of future historians, which most people don't do, and which is very frustrating about people. And could I write a biography of such a person? And the answer is sort of. Really, I only have a good data set for the last 3 years of his life, when he's a student at Western University in 1914, and then the 2 years of his life when he served overseas with the Royal Flying Corps as a pilot, one of the first Canadians to learn to fly. And then the rest of the book is that's the narrative I wrote. I wrote the story of the last 3 years of his life, and then I wrote the story of how I wrote that story for the benefit of students, and I think other readers could find it interesting as well. This is an image of McKay that I had colorized, actually. which is a process I have mixed feelings about, but I think it gives a good impression of what he looks like, and I'll show you the original photo in just a second here. There it is. We use the word black and white photography. This is all wrong. This black and white's actually a later process. The photography of that age actually had beautiful tones, as you can see here. I want you to notice something about this uniform that McKay's wearing with the riding crop and the cavalry breeches and so forth. This is what they call the maternity jacket, the sand brown belt. This is a pilot's uniform from the First World War, a member of the Royal Flying Corps. And they really did, especially in the early days, style themselves as fox hunting gentlemen, you know, a kind of cavalry elite who traded in their horses for airplanes. And this is very much the way the British Flying Corps conceived of itself. But there's this added complication when the First World War comes along, because now you're adding colonial pilots, right? You're adding people from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa. And the British colonial authorities are a little suspicious of these people. And we'll talk a little bit in a second about the obstacles they put in the path for Canadians who wish to fly, particularly early in the war. This is Eddie McKay was not a lifelong Londoner. He probably moved here around 1905, 1906. And he became a well-known local athlete, playing rugby and hockey for a whole number of local teams and leagues. And there's really no way to overemphasize the importance that sport played in the education, particularly of young males at the time. They really saw the playing of sport as a way of ameliorating social conditions at the time that they were concerned were leading to the sort of effeminization of men, right? And that they believed that sports would be a way to arrest this. It would teach the values of proper masculinity. It would make them physically strong, mentally tough, teach them leadership, fair play, etc. And then these in turn would be the generation that would be able to police or defend the empire if need be, which of course is exactly what happened when the war erupted in 1914. So McKay was an outstanding local athlete. He was very well known. I'll talk a little bit about his sports in a second. And when the war came, as I mentioned, he made an unusual decision, which was to become a pilot in the Royal Flying Corps. And this at a time when the vast majority of people had never even seen an airplane. There was only one flight school in Canada, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so the pilots of the First World War, in what was a very big war with millions of soldiers engaged in combat, could appear to be prominent as individuals because there were so few of them. They were styled, as I said, as sort of, you know, fox hunting gentlemen, sometimes called the knights of the air, as if they'd replaced the medieval knights of old, now fighting in single combats in the air instead of jousting on the field. And as a consequence of this, pilots had much greater attention focused to them in the press at the time than would be the case of sort of ordinary rank and file soldiers, of whom there were millions. And so Eddie became something of a local and Southwestern Ontario celebrity during the First World War, even though he's largely forgotten today. So you can see here a small collection of some of the news items that appeared in the local papers about him. And remember that at the time, London, Ontario had two daily papers, both of which published twice daily. I'm losing my slides.
Oh,
there we're back. He was born in December 1892 in Harrington, Ontario, which is this tiny little community near Stratford, still a tiny little community near Stratford. I've actually been there and seen the family home. They actually had a wonderful local history day a few years back. And he's commemorated there in the stained glass in the local Presbyterian church. And this is his mom, to whom he bears a striking resemblance. Poor woman had 9 kids, all of whom lived, which was actually unusual for the time, wasn't uncommon. You know, there's still an era of high childhood mortality. 9 kids, 4 of whom served in the First World War. And sometime, as I mentioned, around 1905, 1906, he made the decision. They lived briefly in Stratford, and then he made the decision to move to London, Ontario, where he lived with his oldest brother, Sandy, on Clarence Street. Sandy was 17 years older than him. And I think I essentially became a sort of parental figure for him. His father had already predeceased.
Went to Central Collegiate, now Central Secondary School. His name is actually on the cenotaph there, although there's a spelling mistake in it. They spelled it McKay rather than McKay. And as I mentioned, became something of a local sports hero. This is him. This is an image of a team that was known as the London Knights. Now, this is not the current London Knights. This was just a local hockey team at the time. There were dozens of local hockey teams at the time, and he was on about 4 or 5 different ones, including there were church leagues, for example, at the time. And that's Eddie, top right. He played center for that team. He was a small guy, even in adulthood, even for the time, a little bit shorter than the average. He was about 5'6", around 135 pounds, but considered to be an excellent player. In 1914, he made what was really an unusual decision for the time, which was to go to university. This at a time when maybe 1% of Canadians went to university. None of his other family members went to university. He came from a farm family, a family of laborers. His older brother was a plasterer, so it's unusual that he would go to university. Family lore has it he wanted to become a dentist, and yet it was actually the Faculty of Arts at Western that he entered. Now, Western at that time is not the Western campus of today. That campus didn't exist until 1924. And in fact, the Middlesex Memorial Tower, this tower that's the symbol of Western, was built as a war memorial. In case you don't know, that's what it is. It was built as a war memorial. McKay never knew that campus. Instead, Western rented space around town, including from Huron College, from which it had originally emerged. And Western today has about 35,000-ish students. At that time, it had 200 students and 14 professors total. So there were about 100 students in the Faculty of Arts and 100 students in the Faculty of Medicine. He joined the Faculty of Arts. The term began back then in August 1914. So he's starting university just as the First World War erupts. Now, as you know, there was this initial rush for people to enlist in 1914, but the statistical majority of people who enlisted in 1914 were recently arrived British immigrants, to such an extent that one Canadian official remarked that the first contingent of the Canadian Expeditionary Force was a British army recruited on Canadian soil. And Canadians who've been born here and the longer ancestral ties here just seem to have somewhat less enthusiasm for signing up immediately. McKay chose not to sign up initially, and that was actually considered okay. There was a sense that people in universities were going to become the future leaders of the country, and that it was an important service to the country to continue your university education. However, he did declare that if the war went on long enough, that he would sign up, and indeed most of his classmates, male classmates, eventually did, to such an extent they actually considered closing the university. They didn't, but they came close. He declared that he would join if the war was still on, once his first year was up. And he declared an interest in becoming a pilot, which is interesting. And where does that come from? An interest in being a pilot at a time when, once again, the vast majority of Canadians had never even seen an airplane, and Canada did not yet have an air force, which is very important. Well, there had been one flight over London. It had occurred in Victoria Day, 1912, as part of the Victoria Day celebrations. And this was the pilot. His name was Beckworth Haven, and that's his plane. I just want you to think about that for a second. Okay, that's his plane. That's 1912 high tech. Beckworth Haven did the first flight over London, Ontario. And there's good evidence that McKay would have seen it, because it flew right over the core of the city, right where we are now, from out at the west. It took off from the Western Fairgrounds. And McKay worked for what was called Darch and Sons. Darch and Sons was part of the old Talbot block, and they made saddles and steamer trunks and stuff like that. He worked there as a clerk to get some money to go to university. And the newspaper at the time had an extraordinary account, which I want to read you from the book, of Haven's first flight over London. And I'll just read you this passage. The pilot who Londoners saw on 25 May 1912 was, in the estimation of the London Free Press, the daring and handsome 22-year-old Beckworth Haven of the Curtis Aviation Company.
Haven had planned his flight for the day before to coincide with Victoria Day celebrations, but thunderstorms had grounded his machine. The weather the next day proved more amenable. Preparing for takeoff on a farm east of the city, he admonished curious onlookers to stay back 50 feet. If you stand too close to the machine when I start the propeller, you'll be knocked head over heels and will be killed, he declared. by the 40 horsepower engine. The London Advertiser reported those who were in line of winds were soon shown that the Birdman knew what he was talking about. Minutes later, the Curtiss biplane droned over the core of the city at 2,000 feet, bringing business to a halt. This is a quotation from the London Advertiser. Crowds of people rushed out of the stores to witness the sight. Out of Richmond barber shop rushed a man with his face covered in lather and the towel still around his neck. A woman in a shoe store rushed out, forgetting for a moment she only had one shoe on. So, it's maybe this type of thing that made McKay air-minded, made him thinking about the possibility of joining the tiny flying corps. The problem is that there were no flying schools in Canada, and Canada did not yet have an Air Force. Now, in the meantime, he had to finish his term at Western, and there was sports to play. And that was the year that Western chose purple as its colors in 1914. And this is Eddie in his rugby team uniform that year. Rugby football, they called it. This is not our game of football with forward passes. Okay? This is rugby that they're playing. And Western won what they call the Dominion Championships that year. This is a very grandiose term for a league that was in southwestern Ontario. They called it the Dominion. It's kind of like the World Series, right? Anyway, this is a league in southwestern Ontario. They called it Dominion Championships. But that cup actually did evolve later into the Grey Cup. Western won it that year, and by playing games locally. And it's extraordinary to read the reporting at the time. And there was intense media interest in this rugby league because of in reading it, we can see their conceptions of masculinity at the time and how men should behave. Also, their attitudes about the war that's breaking out and the sense of foreboding that hangs over these games, that probably it's going to be the case that these young men are going to have to go and fight once they're done their year playing. And in addition, the games are extraordinarily rough. And this is actually an editorial cartoon called How London Won the Championship. And so you can see they essentially beat the hell out of the other team. Fights in the stands were common. Swearing amongst the players were common. And in the local newspapers, they use euphemisms for this. They talked about the players engaging in French practice. Right, we have this expression, pardon my French. So they're using a lot of French out there, and apparently Eddie McKay's French was exceptional when they're playing. And McKay was the highest scorer on the team. He was really the all-star for the team, even though he was by far the smallest player. So they win the championship. Winter comes, plays some hockey, gets through his courses. I was able to actually look up his grades. In the Western Archives. It turns out that all the grades are digitized. My wife's an academic advisor at Western. I just phoned her up one day. I said, "Can you get Eddie's marks?" She said, "Let me see." Checked. 1914. There's his grades. She said, "I can't release them to you. There's privacy restrictions." Coaxed it out of her. 3 C's, a B, and an A. 3 C's, a B, and an A. Very respectable grades for the time. A was in English composition. The B was in French, and then you get C's in other courses. But he had declared this interest in joining the flying services, but Canada didn't have an Air Force. What there was over here was a recruiting mission that the British had sent over to recruit Canadians to be pilots. And they had a very definite idea of the kinds of people they wanted to be pilots. First of all, they wanted gentlemen. They wanted gentlemen. So the guy who ran the recruiting office, his correspondence still exists. It's in the National Archives of Canada. He's writing back to the British Colonial Office saying, literally in one phrase, he said, "I saved you yesterday from a grocer's son who wanted to be a pilot." Right? So there's real prejudice there. So they wanted gentlemen. And so people with education were considered front row candidates. You went to the right type of schools, you played the right type of sports, that type of thing. The second, you had to be a member of a white race. Okay, so Indigenous Canadians, non-white Canadians need not apply. There were occasional exceptions to that later, but generally you had to be a member of a white race. Third, they had had some incidents where they'd recruited people as pilots. The British had paid for their expense to go overseas. They went overseas to train to be pilots and washed out of pilot training. So now they're in England. They have no military training and they can't be pilots. What do they do with them? So they added a stipulation. You have to get your civilian pilot's license here first. And second, you have to be an officer already in some branch of the armed forces. Now, the trick was, if Eddie had signed up for the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the regular army, once he's done that, the army can do whatever it wants with him. So a lot of Canadians did apply to the CEF and then apply for a transfer to the RFC. That transfer wasn't guaranteed, but some did. The transfer to the Royal Flying Corps. That's how Billy Bishop did it, for example. McKay made a different decision. What he did was he joined the militia. He joined the militia. And because the militia stood apart from the CEF, right? You would resign from the militia to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Joined the militia because he had a year of university, got an officer's commission like that, right? It was commissioned lieutenant in the 33rd Hurons. Would have received some basic military training this way, but he still has to get a pilot's license. Now, there is a flight school in Mississauga at Long Branch, about which nobody's written. Somebody needs to do a good history of that flying school. It's a branch of the Curtis Aviation School, and they're at Long Branch in Mississauga, and they're flying out of Toronto Island, which is the beginning of Toronto Island Airport Aviation, right? It's now Billy Bishop Airport. Very strange name an airport after somebody who shot down airplanes, but there we are. There is that school. The weather in the summer of 15 is terrible, and the planes aren't flying very much. And they only had 2 planes anyway. And so they're not graduating many pilots. And McKay knew this. So the next nearest flight school is in Dayton, Ohio. Does anybody know whose flight school is in Dayton, Ohio? The Wright Brothers School of Aviation, still owned and operated by the surviving Wright brother, Orville Wright, the first person to fly an airplane. So this is getting it from the source, okay? It's like learning Cubism from Picasso or, So the problem is that flight instruction was expensive. It was $500 for an estimated 2-week program with about 8 hours in the air. Just to put things in perspective, $500 for a common laborer like McKay would be about 6 months' wages at the time, okay? For a student who's got a part-time job, that'd be about 6 months' wages. The surviving Wright brother was shrewd, and he knew that there were Canadians wanting to get their pilot's license in order to transfer to the Royal Flying Corps. So he cut his prices in half that year to $250. McKay borrows it from an older brother, heads down there in October of 1915. So this is his border crossing card. See, you can see there he is. He's got $290 in his pocket. So he's got $250 for flight instruction, $40 cash to get him through the 2 weeks that he expects to be down there. There's his height, 5'6", dark hair, brown eyes. His race, they ask his race. He listed as Scotch. His parents were born in Scotland. And his destination, the Wright Brothers School of Aviation. And you've got to imagine this 22-year-old guy crossing the border. So proud, right? He's going to go off to the Wright School to become one of the first Canadians to learn to fly. He gets there. The place is jammed to the rafters with Canadians. This is them. This is the group. They're all there learning to fly for the British Flying Services, either the Royal Flying Corps, which is attached to the Army, or the Royal Naval Air Service, which is attached to the Navy. And McKay is in the back row here, right there. Now, it's interesting. Total coincidence. The guy next to him is Roy Brown. No, different Brown. This is Roy Brown, who was later credited with shooting down the Red Baron, possibly erroneously. Okay, Germany's most famous ace. And McKay was erroneously credited with shooting down the Red Baron's mentor, Oswald Boelke, later. So they have this interesting connection between the two of them. Brown's recollections of the Wright School still exist. McKay didn't leave much in the way of diaries or letters, but Brown's letters and diaries actually still exist at the Canadian War Museum. And I should just mention that Brown describes absolute chaos at the Wright School. The weather's bad down there too. They're not flying very much. There's too many people, and there's only one working plane because he smashed up the other one. So it was supposed to be a 2-week program, you know, in November of 1915. In February, they're still trying to get their pilot's license. And it's only 8 hours in the air, right? Very rudimentary. They actually have to transfer the whole school down to Augusta, Georgia. This is them in Augusta for better weather. So that's them in front of the Wright Flyer. That's Eddie there. So they get, finally in February of 1916, he gets his pilot's license. The flight test would have lasted about 20 minutes. You had to do some figure eights in the air. You had to touch down without crashing. You had to get to an elevation of 200 feet and remain there for 10 minutes. Very, very rudimentary piloting stuff. Here's his pilot's license. This is still in the hands of his family. I have it now. It's going to go to the Canadian War Museum. And the Aero Club of America issued pilot's licenses on behalf of the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, which was a French organization. And they tried to standardize pilot training globally. And they numbered the pilot's licenses sequentially for North America. So you can see here, he's number 401, of whom about 350 would have been American. So he's probably one of the first 50 Canadians or so to learn to fly. Goes back to Toronto, where the British recruiting mission is, presents his credentials. I'm a captain in the militia, got a year of university. Here's my pilot's license. They take him, give him a logbook. Still exists. This still in the hands of the family. It ended up being my most important source for the entire project, because in this logbook he recounts every flight he takes for the rest of his life, except of course the last one. Now he's had only very rudimentary pilot training, so at this point they send him to UK for advanced training on the most advanced trainer they had at the time, which is this. This is the Morris Farman Longhorn. So-called, you'll notice it has skis in front of it. That's to stop it from flipping over when it lands. Okay, so you notice the pilot sits in a nacelle out front with no protection from the elements. And unlike the Wright Flyer, which couldn't really go very high, this plane was actually capable of going to about 8,000 feet. Okay, and they're up there without oxygen equipment, just swaddled in whatever they could wear to try to keep warm. And you'll notice it's a pusher. In other words, the propeller is behind the pilot. And so he does his training in England. Now, he was fortunate to arrive at a time where they had just expanded pilot training. So up to that point, it wasn't uncommon for pilots to get an additional. They'd all have their civilian license first, maybe 4 or 5 hours of training. They'd get another 10 to 12 hours of training with the RFC, and then would be sent to France. Like very, very rudimentary training. He was fortunate to arrive just as they expanded training, based on feedback from France that the pilots were getting killed too fast, which they did in the summer of 15. And so he actually got about 50 hours of flying time, which again, by later standards is minimal. But by the standards of the summer of 1916 is actually, spring 1916 is actually not too bad. And he was deemed to be quite a good pilot by his various training squadron commanders. Now, air power at the time, its principal job was reconnaissance. Okay, it's to reconnoiter the enemy line, take pictures of the enemy line. And they could actually turn a picture around in 30 minutes, which is pretty amazing. It's not real time, but it's compared to what they could do in the past. That's very important intelligence, right? So the planes would fly over the enemy front. They would take a picture with a gigantic camera, return with a glass plate, develop it, throw it onto a motorcycle or a horse, and take it to HQ. And then this helps the generals shape and form their understanding of what's in front of them on the battlefield. So this was a critical intelligence. And also airplanes could help you spot your artillery, right? So the airplanes from their vantage point in the air could help you direct your artillery fire by various crude methods of communication. They don't have voice radio yet. Of course, you don't want enemy planes to do this. So this is where fighter planes get developed, right? Your job is to shoot down enemy planes that are reconnoitering your line. Only the best pilots, by the standards of the time, were made fighter pilots, and McKay was deemed one of those, and so he's put into the cockpit of the best British plane of the era, which is the DH-2, which I'll show you a picture of in a second. And he's sent over to France. He arrives on the 1st of July, 1916. Some of you may know that date. This is the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, right in the middle of the war. Battle of the Somme was fought here in this region of France, and it was a combined Anglo-French offensive designed to punch a hole in the German line in that sector. And I'll just zoom up a little bit here. So the city of Amiens, with its famous cathedral, is right over here, and this is the front line. This is the Western Front. And so the British Expeditionary Force went all the way up to the English Channel, all the way down to about here, and then the French army picks up on the other side of the Somme River. So they're going to launch this combined offensive astride the Somme River. Their objective is to punch through the line here, drive up this road. This is the Albert de Bapaume road. It's an old Roman road, and break through the German lines here at Bapaume, out into open countryside. So this is occupied France. This is the region you're looking at. Okay. The plan was to do that in 2 weeks. They went from there to there in 4.5 months for 600,000 casualties. 600,000 casualties. The day McKay arrives in France, he's not yet with the squadron. He gets to the squadron on the 3rd of July. The day McKay arrives in France is the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Some of you may know the British Army loses 20,000 soldiers dead, not killed and wounded. 20,000 soldiers dead on that first day of a battle that lasts for another 4.5 months. So the Somme becomes the very symbol of the misery and the grinding horror of the First World War. Of course, it's horrific on the German side too, and for the French as well. So that's when McKay arrives. By the way, just to give you an idea of distances here, you can bicycle from there to there on sort of at a leisurely pace in about 45 minutes. You know, on a sort of upright bike with a baguette and all that. And I know because I've done it in about 45 minutes. 4.5 months, the entire British Army to get half that distance. Okay. It's a distance of about 15 to 20 kilometers. McKay was assigned to number 24 Squadron, Royal Flying Corps. This was the world's first fighter squadron. First squadron that consisted entirely of planes whose only purpose was to shoot down other planes. So there's no reconnaissance planes or anything like that in this squadron. And it's commanded by this guy who was a legend in the Royal Flying Corps. They called him the Old Man. He was 25 years old. Lano Hopper, who was the first person to win a Victoria Cross for a combat in the air. And he commands this squadron of 18 pilots. And they're flying these. This is the DH-2. This is 1916 high-tech. This is the best plane the British have. And once again, you can see the pilot sits in an open nacelle. These planes fly at 12 to 14,000 feet in the air. No oxygen equipment, very, very cold up there. Not even the heat of the engine for the pilot. The engine's behind him. Not even a top wing above you to protect you from the rain or other elements that you get in that very rainy region of France. So flying in that would have been a very miserable experience. Why is the propeller behind the pilot? Because the British hadn't yet worked out how to fire a machine gun straight in front of you. If there's a propeller straight in front of you, you would blow your own propeller off, right? The Germans have worked out a synchronization mechanism. The British don't have that yet. So the propeller's behind the pilot so that you have unobstructed fire from in front. And so that's what's called a DH-2, top speed around 85 miles per hour. So maybe it's 110, 120 kilometers an hour top speed. Just to give you an idea of how they organize the air services, and I mentioned before that there really are very few pilots. So the British Fourth Army is what leads the offensive in the Battle of the Somme. That Fourth Army has about 500,000 men. This is its entire air component, which is about 120 pilots. So out of 500,000 British soldiers taking part in this offensive, 120 are pilots. In all of France, there's maybe 500 British pilots. And this is what I mean, where individual pilots could assume a degree of prominence much greater than was the case for individual soldiers on the ground. And thus they can become lionized in the press, and they can become propaganda figures too for either side to exploit. And over here, this is 24 Squadron. It's 19 planes. There were 5 others briefly attached to it. 19 planes. Those 19 pilots, Eddie McKay's squadron, they are the entire fighter cover for the British Fourth Army in the Battle of the Somme. Okay, so they truly are what would be called in the Second World War the few. Aerial operations must have been terrifying. I mean, just think about it. I'm a slightly nervous flyer, okay, at the best of times, like on an Airbus going to Europe. I'm kind of a nervous flyer. Can you imagine getting in one of those things? Like even just flying around in it. So now there's people shooting at you while you're doing it. It's been absolutely terrifying. But it's a couple hours a day when the weather's good. So on average, McKay's logbook shows he flies about 1 day in 3. What do they do the rest of the time? Well, here's the advantage of being a pilot, and this is why people would volunteer to do it. Yeah, it's terrifying. Yeah, you don't have a parachute. Yeah, the fuel tank is literally directly under your seat. And the plane is made of balsa wood, you know. But here's why they did it, because they got to live in places like this. This is the Chateau de Bertangla, north of Amiens. It was owned by this elderly French count. And that's where the pilots were quartered. And the airfield is just south of there. Now they later moved down to the airfield itself, and they used that as an HQ and as their mess hall. And the French count just opened up his wine cellar, you know, and Ontario had gone dry in 1916, not so in France, right? There's all kinds of things to indulge in over there. And there are memoirs by some of McKay's squadron mates who talk about night after night of drinking Veuve Clicquot, you know, from the French count's cellar, eating foie gras on toast and so forth. So they have a pretty good life compared to guys in the trenches, right? Who are, you know, it's verminous, they're lice infested, they're under artillery fire at all times. So the pilots have maybe 2 hours of sheer terror. The rest of the time, they have a pretty good life. And they regularly make the trip into Amiens, where there's good restaurants and other delights, including one McKay engaged in because he got a venereal disease. Like approximately 20% of Canadians who served overseas in the First World War, which is a stat we don't often quote on Remembrance Day. Combat in the air depicted in art. There are no photographs from the First World War, no real photographs in the First World War of combat in the air. The photography really didn't exist. There's McKay's flight. So this is B flight of 24 Squadron. That's him there. This is the other pilots. All of them became casualties. Okay. And there are many pictures like that of whole squadrons simply gone. Their counterpart on the other side, and I am cognizant of the time, I'm going to wrap this up in 5 minutes. Their counterpart on the other side, okay, is this guy, 25-year-old Oswald Balke, is considered the founder of the German Air Force fighter wing. And he had returned from the Eastern Front with a group of handpicked pilots, including the young Manfred von Richthofen, who history knows as the Red Baron. There's still a squadron in the Luftwaffe named after Balke. And he becomes a national hero in Germany as their highest scoring fighter pilot, their highest scoring ace. He actually brings down probably about 40 enemy machines. So he's quite a prodigious assassin in the air. And he's because he's a propaganda figure in Germany, he's known on the Allied side. And this sometimes happened because there's relatively few pilots. They kind of got to know their counterparts. And Balke is this sort of boogeyman in the British flying services. And he actually kills a number of McKay's squadron mates. In October of 1916, McKay and a fellow Canadian named Arthur Knight, who was a student at the University of Toronto, are returning from patrol when they get jumped by 8 planes from Balke's squadron. And we actually have 5 accounts of this battle, including McKay's own account. And it's here written in the squadron record book in his handwriting on the left, and then typed up in the combats in the air report on the right. What happened was Bolke got directly behind Arthur Knight, and Manfred von Richthofen, the future Red Baron, directly behind McKay. And McKay and Knight probably thought, we're dead. You know, they're outnumbered 4-1. The Germans have better planes. They know who's behind them. And they just began frantically flying around. And Bolke and his squadron are frantically flying around too. And then suddenly Bolke collides with another plane and goes spinning down out of control, hits the ground, blows up, dead. McKay gets back home, back to the squadron base with a good story. Wow, that was a close one. And then a month later, this happens. It's the equivalent of what we today would say a story going viral. It appears in the London Free Press, a London Advertiser rather, and then it gets picked up by pretty much every newspaper in North America. That Eddie McKay of London, Ontario had shot down Oswald Bolke. And so here you see it in the local papers. You know, London boy sends great German flyer to his death. The aviator Eddie McKay of this city was the heroic airman who caused the death of the king of German flyers. He had done no such thing, and he recorded in his own logbook that he did no such thing. And he actually sent a letter home saying, I did no such thing. But the story, you know, he just ran for his life and got lucky, and Bolke collided with somebody else. And the story got out ahead of him. And for a brief time, he was nationally famous. And I think he was really one of the first Canadian pilots in the First World War to become nationally famous, and probably did a lot to inspire later Canadian pilots who gained even greater fame. Okay. He survives the Battle of the Somme, makes it through to March 17. He's still with the squadron. By the time March rolls around, he's the last member of the squadron. Both Leno Hawker himself was actually killed by the Red Baron in November. He's actually the last surviving member of the squadron who was there when the Battle of the Somme began. And they decided to promote him and send him back to England to train pilots, because they figure if you survive 8 months at the front, you're probably good at B2. Goes back to England to train pilots, gets promoted to captain, trains people at the Central Flying School at Uphaven, which is right near Stonehenge. They loop the loops over Stonehenge. Probably could have stayed there. Not probably, certainly could have stayed there and just trained pilots for the rest of the war. But something compelled him to go back to the front. And he volunteered to go back to the front in October of 1917. And why? Why did he go back to the front? I don't know entirely, but I think when I read the sports reporting on Eddie McKay from when he was a student at Western playing hockey, playing rugby, he was mean out there. He was a rough player. He hated losing. He hated being behind. And in many respects, the British are still losing the war in 1917. And I think he had a real zeal to get back to the front and fight again, not just train pilots. And that's hard for our generation to imagine, that someone would actually, having experienced the horrors of combat, would actually wish to return to it. It's very difficult for subsequent generations to process, but I think eminently understandable at the time. He goes back to the front, and now flying a much more sophisticated plane. This is the SPAD 7, much more powerful plane. There's rapid technological progress. And there he's not made a squadron commander, but a flight leader. He's a captain by now. And this photograph of him was taken the morning after his 25th birthday, on the 20th of December, 1917, by a fellow Canadian whose last name is Trudeau. No relation that I know of, but it could be. He actually went on to be a general in the Canadian services between the wars. This was taken early in the morning. And that day, the day after his 25th birthday, McKay led his squadron, his flight, over the front near Arras, dove on an enemy two-seater, and was killed, spiraled down, and his plane landed somewhere in no man's land. His body was recovered by the Germans. I've seen the German reports, but subsequently lost. It was buried somewhere in occupied Belgium, but the grave subsequently lost. The letter home is extraordinary. This is the letter home. It was actually printed in the London Free Press. from his commanding officer to McKay's oldest brother, Joe McKay, who had struck it rich in mining in Cobalt, Ontario. And these letters often tend to be pro forma. But in this case, the squadron commander had known McKay for about 2 months. McKay was his best pilot. It seems genuinely heartfelt. He says he was 1 in 1,000 and the best man I had. And he says something here that's really quite extraordinary, which is that he says that, okay, there's a small chance that he's alive as a prisoner of war, but he wouldn't want that. He would rather die than become a prisoner of war. And I thought, I'm not sure how a family today would process a message like that. I think a lot of people would find it offensive, but again, it was a different time, a very different generation, different conceptions of manhood and of the duties of a warrior. And it probably was very comforting to them, right? It would be a very small recompense, a compensation to spend the rest of the war as a prisoner for him. That concludes McKay's brief life. After the war, a monument was made for the 1,000 British pilots who died in the First World War and who have no known grave. That monument is at Arras, France. It's part of the larger Arras Memorial to the Missing. And there's his name on that monument, Alfred Edwin McKay. So, you know, what does all this mean? Just try to sum up. I mean, apart from the fact, an interesting story about a Londoner that many people have never heard of. I really think that in looking at an individual like this, particularly for my students, I think there's really two points of importance. The first is that it's sad but true that it is the fate of most of us eventually to be forgotten. Most of us don't visit our great-grandparents' graves, for example. And so I think that shining a light on one person can help save one person from historical oblivion. And I think shining a light on someone who was not particularly famous can be highly illuminating, actually. McKay never reached the level of fame of someone like Billy Bishop or someone like that. He was never greatly decorated or anything like that. I think by looking at an experience like this, we can get a greater sense of what in his case, a typical pilot's life would have been like than by looking at someone who had achieved very great fame. And the second thing is, I think by focusing on an individual reminds us of the awesome consequences of war. Right? In a decent world, in a better world, I should say, Eddie McKay would have not had to go to war. He would have played rugby at Western and gotten his B's and his C's and gone on to be a dentist and had a family, or all the things that his siblings, you know, went on to do and had that life. I think that by focusing on biographies of people who fell, it's a reminder to us today that going to war is a dreadful thing. It's a very serious business, and it's not something to be undertaken lightly. The book is called 1 in 1,000, The Life and Death of Eddie McKay, Royal Flying Corps. I will give it a plug here. It's available on Amazon.com for about $25. And I get $1 of that. So I'm here to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Probably 2 points in one question. I noticed the hesitancy of those in the RFP, Canadians, to give up their infantry designations. The commanding officer's letter home to McKay's family still said, was it 8 Hussars?
Yeah.
And his initial commanding officer is wearing Grenadier Collegial on his jacket, but he's got his wings. Yeah. When did they finally start kind of making the break to that type of jacket that I associate more with RFC?
So it's interesting. They had these earlier for people like McKay, who are what they called special reserve. So he didn't have that regimental background, right? He just served in a Canadian militia unit. And so those uniforms would have been for those men. And then, of course, what happens in April 18 is the 2 British flying services, the Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps, attached to the Navy and the Army respectively, are merged into the RAF. And that begins a completely separate RAF tradition. Okay. But yeah, that as you know, that regimental system throughout the whole British Empire / Commonwealth is very important, but particularly in the UK. And so a lot of those pilots would have been regular Army, pre-war regular Army members who were very proud of those associations with their regiments, and they would have continued to wear their regimental uniforms. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, Lee.
How does someone become an ace, flying ace, to recognize?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's something that a lot of people there's a whole community of people who are sort of aviation buffs who study aces and obsessively compute their scores and so on. It's not that much of a thing at the time. It's surprising. The French press had said at the time that an ace is someone who shot down 5 or more planes, but this isn't something that exists officially in the British flying services. It's not an official designation. And in fact, the term itself doesn't seem to have been widely known or used in the British flying services until very late in the war. So I actually did use all the newspapers from the time are digitized, and I looked for the use of the term in the British and Canadian press for the First World War, and I didn't see it once before 1918 in the context of being a pilot. So it's an informal designation. It's not something the British actually did. The British counted what they called, they just counted combats in the air, and they had a bunch of different ways of reporting them. And those standards changed over time too. And so depending on how you count, McKay had somewhere between 4 and 14 victories in the air because the standards change over time. Yeah.
So you created another part of this book in how you teach your students how to do this. Can you just, in a nutshell, tell us some of the things that are necessary in order to do the research in order to produce something like this?
Yeah, so it took, this actually started as a class project. I realized there wasn't a marker for him at Western. So in 2007, I had a class do a project on him, gather some local data, and we put a plaque for him near the tower at Western. So if you're there walking on the pathway up to the tower, you'll see it. And that sort of got the ball rolling. And then I did a great deal further research. It took a lot because I mean I had to look through. So just for example, we start locally. You know, what's at the London Room? What's at the Western Archives? What's here at Museum London? What's at the Library and Archives of Canada, right? Because he's a Canadian, so there's going to be certain records there. But a lot of his records are going to be in the UK, right? So I have to go there. But he also went to the Wright Flying School in Dayton, Ohio. So I'm at Wright State University getting photos. National Archives in the UK have records of Canadians who learned to fly in the United States, et cetera, right? So you're traveling around a lot. Then there's the fact that I subsequently discovered the Germans had recovered his remains. And so now I'm going through German records. I don't speak German. So I had to get help. I had to get help there. And then there's the question of, what do you do with sources once you've got them? How do you assess them? How do you analyze them? What do you do with things you can't quite figure out or understand? So have I got 1 minute to give an example? Yeah.
You got it.
Awesome. This woman, her name's Maud Palmer. In the spring of, in January 1918, McKay went missing. He was listed as missing in December of 17. In January of 18, she wrote a letter to the Swiss Red Cross saying, and that's how families communicated to POWs was through the Red Cross. Is he alive? Is he a POW? And I found this record in the Red Cross files, which are digitized and online from the First World War. But I had no idea who she is. And so when I saw this name that a woman named Maud Palmer was inquiring about Eddie McKay and whether or not he's still alive as a POW, I thought, oh, wow, he had a girlfriend. And then I looked her up, and she was born in 1863. So she was 30 years older than him. And she was, as I got researching her history, I discovered she was married to quite a famous British portrait painter named Henry Sutton Palmer. So why is this woman investigating Eddie McKay. So I thought, well, maybe he was billeted with her home. No, they didn't live. He never lived anywhere near her when he was in the UK. So then I got thinking, she was inquiring about this guy. This is my guy's AE McKay. This is EA McKay. He's a Canadian. Exact same time of service as Eddie McKay. And there were so many times I went looking for AE McKay and ended up with EA McKay. I began to curse this poor guy. And he actually did become a prisoner of war. So I thought, and by the way, your question's fortuitous because I got a whole bunch of slides here lined up for it. I thought he actually did end up as a prisoner of war. And I thought, oh, she was inquiring about him. And it's just a typo, AE instead of EA. But then when I got the logbook, tucked into it was this, a power of attorney from Eddie's brother to Maud Palmer, that woman. So she was inquiring about him. So I asked the family member, this is like a great nephew, no living person remembers McKay. I said, do you know who this woman was? And they said, no, we were hoping you knew who she was. So I had no idea. I spent weeks trying to figure this out. And I still haven't. And every now and then I check to see if there's some kind of connection. I did have a theory. Does anybody, I had a working theory. Anybody want to guess what I think the connection possibly could have been? She had a daughter, Camille, painted by her father here. She was the same age as McKay. And she worked here. She slung chow. It was called Eagle Hut, where Canadian and American servicemen would go to get North American food. They could get pancakes and stuff like that. Maybe he met her. Maybe he had a girlfriend. And that was the connection between the families. I have no evidence for this as the problem, right? So I wrote that up in the book as one example of the process that historians go through to try to get at the past and how it's like prospecting for gold. You dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and you hope for a nugget. And here I dug and dug and dug and dug and dug and I got pyrite. You know, like I have no evidence. I have no evidence that the two of them were ever connected. But I keep their pictures together in a folder on my computer. I'm a romantic at heart. And she did go on to marry a pilot. So an American pilot had that. So yeah, I don't know. I think I have time for maybe for one more question.
Chris, you have some online ones?
Oh, yeah. Huh.
Just if you don't mind repeating this question, just so.
Sure.
But really quickly, somebody asked, why is it called the maternity jacket?
Why is it called a maternity jacket? I think because it resembles a doctor's smock from the time. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of. But there might be a uniform buff in the room who knows better than I do. I don't know. No. Sorry, I wish I could help with that one more.
Does that mean I can ask one more? Okay. So I'm wondering if you could speak on the parallels of the images of masculinity in 1914 compared to today. Do you see parallels? Are they completely opposite? Is that a lecture?
Yeah, that's a PhD thesis right there. So the question was parallels between masculinity in 1914 and masculinity today. Here's what I can say. We see in certain circles today great anxiety about masculinity. And part of it, frankly, is homophobia and anti-transphobia. There's real concern about what's happening to men. And it manifests itself in various ways. And you can see it in, for example, Jordan Peterson's entire career is sort of predicated upon that fear, right? What was it Leroy said? Facts in the absence of reason or something like that. Like it's that sort of fear, right? Joe Rogan, the very, very popular podcaster, all his career is really predicated upon that. And what's the solution? For Joe Rogan, the solution is mixed martial arts, right? Sports. And there's a real parallel. There's a real parallel that we see. There was a very great concern in the late 19th century that males were becoming effeminate because they were spending so much time in school their forebears had gone out and chopped down wildernesses and so forth, and now they're working factory jobs, or they're working labor in offices and so forth. And how can we ameliorate this? Sports, right? Rigorous physical competition to build real men who can police the empire. And the same types of discussions are going on today, right? What will we do with this current crop of young men if the war comes? If they're not physically rigorous, mentally tough, right? So those types of parallels exist, and it's all a fantastical fear, of course.
So as Chris is coming up, and I'll try to project so the audience, the online audience can hear a comment that was interesting. I'm listening and watching with my 90-year-old husband who served in the RCAF in the early 1950s. We've enjoyed this talk very much. My mother grew up in London in the 1930s. Her father served in both wars. So.
Thank you for that. Thank you.
Fantastic. And of course, my last question on my notepad that I wrote down was, where can we get a copy of this book? So thank you for covering that.
Amazon, but you know what? Go down and support Oxford Books and order it from them, please. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating. And
Thank you.
that's a little.
Thanks very much.